Hey everyone, happy to have you here. Right now, really? Hey everyone, happy to have you here with me once again. Welcome back. Today, as you can see in the title, we're going to be shaming myself because I'm going to be sharing the palettes that so far this year I haven't even touched once. Not even for one shade. And that's the other thing. If I will show you all the palettes that I haven't used, or I have only reached for one shade in the palette, the list will be even longer. And hopefully this will help me to remind myself why I don't need any other new palettes. Because yeah, today I was super close to purchase 2 new palettes, and as long as I don't reach for the palettes that I already have, I shouldn't be purchasing any newer palettes. But yeah, that's the whole idea for today's video. I hope this is an idea that you find interesting. I really love to see this kind of content in other channels, so let's start with the video. And I'm going to take out my glasses because the reflection of the ring light really distracts me. And if you can hear something in the background, my cat decided to start playing right now as I'm trying to film. So yeah, let's start. I don't know where to start. Okay, and let's start with this palette, and I'll try to give my best explanation, my best excuse of why I haven't reached for a palette. So first we have my So Very Lovely palette from Colourpop. This is a palette that when first launched, I was really interested about, but I decided not to purchase. But I think it was like a year ago in the last cold sale, Colourpop had this palette for around 70% off, so I decided to purchase it. And I don't have excuses for this palette because I shouldn't have purchased it. That's all. This is a palette that it's pretty. I think maybe I will feel inspired to reach for it in spring, but it's a palette that I didn't need in my collection. I think that I was really smart not to purchase this palette when it first launched, and then I was not that smart when I ended up purchasing it because it was on sale. And let's move on with something different. And here I have my Soft X palette from Revolution. This is a palette that, again, when I was in Scotland, I was really tempted to buy, but I decided not to. But in my birthday of this year, a friend of mine decided to give this palette to me, and I really appreciate it, but I haven't used it yet. It's a nice palette, it's really pretty. Now I know that Revolution is not it doesn't have the best quality in its palette, and especially this one that is a little bit older. I'm not expecting too much out of it, but I should play around with it. I know that a lot of people love this palette when it first launched, and this is a palette that I'm going to keep because it was a really thoughtful present, but I still need to use it. And let's start talking about something a little bit different. Let's go with this one over here. This is my Smittens in Switzerland palette from BH Cosmetics. And this is a palette that I feel like I'm explaining why I have the palettes more than why I haven't used them. But this is a palette that I purchased because someone said that it was kind of a dupe to the Untamed palette from Sigma, and I was wanting that palette, but that is a high-end brand, so I didn't want to pay full price for it. So I decided to go with this palette over here that it's supposed to have a similar color story. Now that I have it, I still don't have the Untamed palette, but the more I look at it, I don't see how this palette is supposed to be similar to the Untamed. Maybe a similar inspiration, but the palettes are quite different. Some of the most interesting colors that the Untamed palette has, this palette doesn't. So yeah, I think the reason why I haven't reached for this palette is because it's really difficult for me to create a whole look only using this palette. I feel like I'm missing some cooler tones transition shades, because we have like some mauves over here, some kind of pinky neutrals, this mac and cheese orange, but nothing that I will use, for example, with this silver, with this blue. So for that reason, it's a little bit harder for me to reach for this palette. And now that winter is almost over, I don't know when I'm going to reach for this palette, because again, this is a palette that I feel like it's good for autumn and winter, but not as much in summer. So who knows what is going to happen. Thank you! Okay, the angle changed a lot because my cat decided to play it with a tripod. I never know how to say it. The thing where I have the cell phone to film. Okay, but let's move on with another palette that I'm a little bit worried about, because again, once winter ends, I don't know how often I will want to use this palette. As you can see, that this is my Dutch Taupe palette from Colourpop. It's a cool tone palette and it's really pretty. I really enjoy using it. And the only reason why I can think of that I didn't have used this palette so far this year, it's because I've been really focused in my Pandos eyeshadows. So I haven't had an excuse to reach for this palette. And let's move on talking about this palette over here, which makes me really sad that I haven't used yet. This is my Nervina palette, the original one. This one I purchased for myself at my birthday this year, and it's completely untouched. Yeah, it's brand new. As I said, it's a new palette in my collection this year, and since I haven't used it this year, that means that I haven't used it at all. It's brand new. I have swatched a couple of shades so far, and I'm really impressed. I'm really looking forward to play around with this palette, but for some reason I haven't. And again, I will say that the reason for that is because I'm really focusing in my palettes in projects, and this one hasn't been in a project yet. But yeah, this is a perfect color story for spring. So hopefully once spring gets here, I'm going to use it. And talking about another palette that is just perfect for spring, I have my Enchanted palette from Sigma over here. And as I said, this is perfect for spring, so I really hope that I'm going to use it once spring gets here. I don't have excuses. It's really pretty, and I just purchased a couple other Sigma palettes that I'm really excited about, so hopefully before the end of the year I will get use out of all of my Sigma palettes, even if right now this is my only Sigma palette, but that's going to change pretty soon. Okay, let's move on with a neutral palette that is super simple for me to know why I haven't used it, and I'm talking about my The Warrior palette from Juvia's Place. And this is a palette that the only reason why I haven't reached for it, it's because it's such a basic and neutral palette, which I love, that I have these colors in all of my palettes. So unless I'm reaching for this specific palette for some reason, I can get these colors basically in any palette in my collection. So yeah, so far I haven't even think about reaching for this palette. It has been on my mind for months now, because I know that I haven't used it. I know that it's a really pretty palette, but I haven't found an excuse to reach for this palette over some others that I already have in my collection, and that maybe again I'm focusing in a project. So yeah, that's really sad. And the last palette that, no, not the last palette in the video, but the last palette, oh no, it's, yeah, no, the last palette that I'm worried about, because it's a winter palette for me and I haven't reached for it this winter, is my Ayana palette from Natasha Denona. This was my first Natasha Denona palette, and I have to say that I didn't love it. I don't love the formula in this palette. I don't love the colors. When I look at it, I think it's really pretty, but when I apply it, I feel like this color story is way too dark for my skin tone, and for that reason, it's really hard for me to reach for this palette in general. And the other winter palette, that I have here, but I'm not really worried about, is my Naughty palette from Huda Beauty. And the only reason why I'm not worried about it is because I just roll it in my Project 10 uses, so I know that I'm going to get use out of it pretty soon. And let's move on with some ColourPop, because as I said, I have a lot of ColourPop for this video, but I haven't talked about it yet. Okay, and I have all of these 9-pan palettes plus this quad over here. Thank you again. So let's start with this quad. This is Silver Spoon. It's a cool tone gray quad, and it's super pretty. I'm really happy that I have it in my collection now, because I was tempted to buy the 9-pan palette Blowing Smoke. I don't know if that's the official name now, because they changed the name at some point. But yeah, I was tempted to buy a 9-pan palette that it's quite monochromatic with gray tones, blacks, and silvers. And I feel like this gave me that, but in a smaller version. And I don't need that many gray tones, because it's not a color that I'm super inspired to reach for, but it's something that I like to have in my collection. I haven't even touched this, and now that I'm looking at it, it's so freaking pretty. I really need to play around with it. And talking about the 9-pan palettes, let's go with these two first. My Main Squeeze palette and my Orange You Glad. These palettes are kind of old in my collection. Well, not really old, but older. Like, these are my older ColourPop palettes. I got this in the bundle that has 6 monochromatic rainbow palettes, and I don't like these palettes. I mean, it's not that I don't like them, but I don't really like using oranges and reds on my eyes. So there is nothing really wrong with these palettes, but it's just something that I don't like to use. So yeah, the only reason why I'm keeping these palettes is because I know that if at some point I decided that I want to do a red or orange eye look, I want to be able to reach for these palettes because the quality is good. I just don't reach for the colors, but there is nothing wrong with the palettes. Another kind of older palette, well, not that old, but older ColourPop palette in my collection is Blush Crush. And I cannot explain why I haven't reached for this palette. I'm missing a shade, I know. But this palette is one of my favorites in my collection, and I haven't even touched it. Most likely I'm going to use it now that spring is almost here. I feel like spring is the perfect season for this palette, and that's the only reason that I can think of why I haven't reached for this palette just because otherwise this palette is amazing. And talking about my last two 9-pan palettes from ColourPop, I have my Wild Child. What are you doing? Hey! Sorry, my cat again. So yeah, these are newer in my collection and I haven't touched them yet. These are completely brand new. Again, these are color stories that I think they will suit better in winter than in summer, but I will need to find an opportunity to reach for this. This is quite neutral, so I can actually use it any time of the year. This is a little bit more darker, but it's a purple palette. I love purple, so for me, all year is a good season to use purples. And I only have 3 more palettes to talk about. And since we were talking about a purple palette, let's talk about my Abh Nervina Volume 5, I think it is. Yeah, this is the Volume 5. This was my most expensive palette in my collection. I'm kind of sad and disappointed of myself because it's no longer my most expensive palette, and when I purchased it I was horrified by the price, and now I have even more expensive palettes, but that's out of the point of this video. But since this is one of the most expensive palettes in my collection, I'm really sad that I haven't reached for it, and I don't know why. It's a nice palette, it's really pretty, The formula is nice, but since I got it, I think I have used it 2 or 3 times maybe. And it's really pretty. It's full of purple. I don't know why I'm not reaching for this palette. And the last 2 palettes are these 2 over here. Let's start talking about the smaller one. This is a rainbow palette. It was a gift from my boyfriend. And I don't want to say this to him, but the formula is not that good. So I know why I haven't reached for this palette yet. And the last palette that I need to talk to you about is my Zodiac Love Signs palette. And this is another palette that I'm thinking that maybe I should use the clutter, because I didn't purchase this palette for the right reason. I only purchased it because I was already purchasing the original Zodiac palette and I wanted its sister. But that's not a good reason enough for me anymore. And this is a nice palette. I like it, but I just don't reach for it. I don't know. I don't feel inspired every time that I look at it. And also, it's such a huge palette. I would prefer it if it was a little bit smaller. But those are all the palettes that I haven't used so far this year. I think I have like 17, 18 palettes. I'm not sure. I leave the number over here. But yeah, I'm really ashamed of myself for the amount of palettes that I haven't touched so far this year. Some of them, I know why I haven't used them, but some others, I don't know. But yeah, that's everything for today. I'm going to end up this video before my cats start playing with my angle again. But yeah, that's everything for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please consider subscribing. I will love that. Leave me a comment with how many palettes in your collection you haven't used yet so far this year, if you know the number. But yeah, that's everything for today, and I hope I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!